Greetings, I'm Michael Nagler from the Meta Center for Nonviolence, and I'm talking to you today in connection with a major project of the Meta Center, which is Educators for Nonviolence and for Teachers Without Borders. And we're talking about a book called Search for a Nonviolent Future, which I wrote 10 years ago after teaching a course in nonviolence at the University of California for about 18 or 20 years. And we're going to go through this book chapter by chapter to give you, as teachers, a sense of how you can use it, identify the main points, and I will leave it up to you, of course, to figure out the best formats to get this material at the disposal of your students. But the first chapter is called Hard Questions, Hard Answers. The reason for that is I think we're constantly being encouraged to ask ourselves the wrong questions about nonviolence and especially about violence. For example, every time there's a violent episode that's reported to us in the mass media, which is constantly, the questions that the journalists answer for us are trivial. What kind of handgun? Was this gang related? So on and so forth. So the first and most important purpose of this chapter, the job that it has to do and that you'll have to do with your students to get them some kind of understanding of what nonviolence is and how it works, which once they've understood it, I think they'll never be the same again. But in order to get there, they have to fight through the conditioning of our modern media and its approach. And so the first question is, how do we get below the surface whenever there's a violent act? We may not need to use that language, how to get below the surface, but we have to get students to understand that underneath every act of violence is the phenomenon of violence itself. So to get all tangled up in the particular characteristics of this act will only distract us from the underlying principle, which is where we have to go in order to solve the problem. So I use this example of seeing a poster, placard on the Berkeley campus when I was still teaching there, where it says something about fight anti-Asian hate crimes. And I encourage people to think that before we can get rid of anti-Asian hate crimes, we have to get rid of hate crimes themselves. In other words, just redirecting the hatred against Asian people to hatred against some other kind of people is only shuffling the damage around without resolving it. So we don't want any hate crimes at all, and in order to not have any hate crimes at all, we have to have no hate. So how to encourage people to get down to that deep level of the issue. And I start the chapter off actually discussing the suicide of a teenager in Boston as it was reported in the newspapers. And again, it was all looking for specifics of that neighborhood and its culture, which may account for why so many teenagers had committed suicide. But the point is not why did more people in this neighborhood commit suicide than teenagers in that neighborhood, but rather why are teenagers committing suicide? This is a point in life where the window opens and the vista of possibilities is supposed to be wide open for them. We're supposed to give them a keen sense of ambition and enthusiasm. The world is theirs for them to explore, and instead they're turning against life itself. And this is a tragedy which we can no longer deny, and we have to get at the core of. And of course, since I wrote this chapter, the phenomenon of suicide has gotten much worse because of this returning of veterans from the Middle East wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, where the suicide rates go up and up and up with each successive war. There's very little of this in World War II, where we still could convince ourselves that we were fighting for a just cause. Korean War, not so much so. It starts to get very serious in Vietnam, where it became clear early on that that war was based on a lie. And of course now it's drastically escalated. So in order to get to the root cause of all of this, we have to ask ourselves some pretty deep questions, which Chapter 1 attempts at least to introduce us to. We have to think in terms of prevention of these crimes at the human level. we have to begin to realize that the capacity for nonviolent change is an undeveloped potential within us. It's not something that's going to come from laws, from the economic system. And we have to face the very deep question, what is life about? What is the purpose of life? Without some sense that life has a purpose, life will become cheap, and there will be all sorts of violence. The violence directed at oneself, known as murder, and known as suicide, and the violence directed as others, known as murder and so forth, and war and so forth. So that's the point of this chapter. Don't be taken in by the details of the individual case. Look underneath and look to the deeper causes that lie within the human being, and do so by asking ourselves what basic phenomenon about our life is not being fulfilled. Other things that you might find of use in this chapter are the various respects in which I had to show, and I'm going to do this repeatedly through the book, how this idea that we are separate material entities doomed to competition and ultimately to violence, how that idea has come about and how it is dunned into our heads. And I have this quote from a 14th century mystical document called the Cloud of Unknowing, which has this glorious image of the human being, which says that everything in creation, even the stars in all of their magnificence, are far below us because we have this human consciousness and we have the capacity to realize who we are. Now, I'm not saying that that was common knowledge in the 14th century, but at least it was something that you could say and get away with. And now, because of this relentless propaganda of the mass media that, truth is violent and reality is ugly, recently I was with a very dear friend of mine on an airplane trip from the Midwest, and there was a film going on which neither of us wanted to look at, but every time we glanced up at the screen, there was some act of horrific violence. Now, since writing Search for a Nonviolent Future, I became aware of a new discovery in modern science called mirror neurons. I won't talk in depth about that here, but I will say that what it has shown, that even in our neuromuscular system, in our central nervous system, there is an inbuilt mechanism for empathetic connection with another human being. So that if I see a person in pain, that pain is actually registering in my own mind. I'm going through that same suffering. So if we could even begin to get students to grasp the significance of this, they would immediately realize why we try to discourage them from hurting others. Because when they hurt others, they're hurting themselves. And let's turn that around. When they help others, they're helping themselves. And there's abundant evidence for that also from a variety of fields. So I would close by a quote that's in this last section of the chapter that talks about the purpose of life. It was a young person who was asked about a series of television ads that then President Bill Clinton was producing for the purpose of combating cigarette smoking. And this teenager, and they often have much smarter things to say than much more adult people, especially about what teenagers are like. He said, "In my opinion, many young people who smoke and say they don't know why are subconsciously choosing death. So telling them over and over again that smoking will kill them is, of course, not the answer. If the president is serious, he's got to find ways to help them imagine a future that is a meaningful future for themselves as individuals. And because we don't exist as isolated individuals, but we exist in part of a human connection, as Martin Luther King said, this is an inextricable web of destiny that we're all in. And as Thich Nhat Hanh says, our mode of being is what it should be called interbeing, that my reality is a shared reality with you and yours with me. Until and unless we realize that, we won't be motivated to help another. And without that motivation and without that activity, we will never find satisfaction. I know that recently a U.S. Marine who was handing out relief supplies in South Asia after the bad tsunami a few years ago was asked how he felt about doing this. And he said, you know, in my 30 years of serving the country, this is the only time that I ever got any fulfillment. So we have to capture that fulfillment, we have to understand it, we have to make it available to our students, and then we will already be well on our way to overcoming violence. Thank you very much. That's chapter 1.